My daughter-in-law laughed before she even finished unwrapping the painting. If it's not worth $50, don't bother. For a second, the whole Christmas table went quiet. I looked at my son, Trevor. I had raised that boy after his mother, and I built our life from almost nothing. I had expected him to say something. Anything. Instead, he shrugged. Dad, she doesn't want your junk. Take it back. So I did. I wrapped the painting again, carried it out through the snow, and drove home without giving either of them the argument they were waiting for. What Trevor didn't know was that I had painted that picture nearly 30 years earlier, back when I still believed I might make a living as an artist. What I didn't know was that someone had been searching for it. 7 days later, a private collector agreed to pay $200,000 for that same piece of junk. I thought that would be the end of it. Then my phone rang. Trevor didn't congratulate me. He said, "Dad, that money should have been ours." That was when Christmas stopped being about a rejected gift. Because once my son and his wife discovered what one painting was worth, they started asking questions about every canvas still hanging in my studio. And before this was over, I would learn why Trevor had spent 30 years dismissing my art, how far Morgan was willing to go to profit from my name, and what my late wife had quietly preserved from the life I thought I'd lost. But the biggest surprise wasn't what my paintings were worth. It was what happened when I finally stopped letting my family put a price on me. My name is Ed Lawson. I was 68 years old that Christmas, a retired community college art instructor who had spent most of his working life teaching other people how to see what was right in front of them. I had been a widower for 5 years, and since Nancy died, my son Trevor had become the last living piece of the family we had built together. Maybe that was why I tried so hard with him. Too hard, if I am being fair. Trevor and his wife, Morgan, were hosting Christmas early that year because they planned to spend the actual holiday with friends in Vermont. Their house sat at the end of a curved street lined with young maples and expensive SUVs, the kind of neighborhood where every porch wreath looked professionally arranged. Morgan had a gift for making things look expensive. That was part of her job. She ran a home staging business, and every room in their house seemed ready for a magazine photographer. When I arrived, there were already wrapped boxes beneath the tree. Thick ribbon, metallic paper, brand names printed where nobody could miss them. My gift looked different. I had wrapped it myself in brown paper and tied it with a dark green ribbon I found in a drawer at home. Morgan noticed immediately. "What did you bring?" she asked. "A painting." Her eyebrows rose slightly. I should have heard the warning in that. Trevor came over and took my coat while I carried the package into the living room myself. The painting was called Winter Orchard No. 3. I had painted it nearly 30 years earlier, when Trevor was still a boy and Nancy still kept fresh flowers on our dining table even in January. For most of those years, the painting had hung above that same table. Nancy loved it. I never entirely understood why. It was quiet. Bare apple trees under a pale winter sky. Snow gathered along the stone wall at the edge of the orchard. Nothing dramatic, nothing colorful enough to demand attention. But Nancy used to sit across from it during dinner and say, "That one feels like home." After she died, I moved it into my studio. I thought Trevor should have it eventually. And because Morgan cared so much about decorating their house, I convinced myself Christmas was the right time. We ate first. Morgan had prepared prime rib, roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, and a dessert that looked too perfect to touch. I complimented everything because it was genuinely good, and because complimenting things had become one of the ways I kept peace around their table. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Morgan opened a leather handbag from Trevor. Trevor opened a new watch from Morgan. There were gift cards, imported candles, a bottle of bourbon in a wooden presentation case. Then Trevor reached for my package. "This one's for Morgan," I said. She took it from him and laughed lightly at the weight. "You didn't frame another family photograph, did you?" "No." I smiled. "At least I don't think you'll need to dust this one as often." She pulled the ribbon loose. The brown paper fell away. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the painting. I watched her eyes move over the bare orchard, the gray-blue sky, the old wooden frame Nancy had chosen decades earlier. I waited for recognition, not recognition of the painter, recognition of where it had hung, of the dining room, of Nancy, of all those Sunday dinners when Trevor brought Morgan over while they were still dating. Morgan gave a small laugh, not a warm one. She looked at Trevor, then back at me. "If it's not worth $50, don't bother." I thought I had misheard her. The room seemed strangely quiet despite the Christmas music playing from a speaker near the fireplace. I looked at Trevor. That was the part I remember most clearly, not Morgan's laugh, my son's face. I wasn't expecting him to scold his wife. I wasn't asking him to choose between us. I just wanted the smallest sign that he understood what had happened. A wince, a quiet, Morgan, anything. Instead, Trevor shrugged. Dad, she doesn't want your junk. Take it back. My fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. For a moment, I almost explained everything. I nearly told them how Nancy used to stop beneath that painting before turning off the dining room light, how she once made me promise not to stick it in some dark storage room because, in her words, that painting belongs where family can see it. I nearly reminded Trevor that he had eaten hundreds of meals beneath it, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Morgan had already turned toward another gift. Maybe it was Trevor checking his phone. Or maybe I had finally grown tired of explaining why something mattered to people who had already decided it didn't. I stood. I'll take it home. Trevor looked up. Don't make this a thing, Dad. There it was. The sentence I had heard in different forms for years. Don't make this difficult. Don't take it personally. Don't make everyone uncomfortable. I nodded once. I said I'll take it home. I wrapped the painting again at the end of their kitchen counter. Nobody helped me. On the drive back, a thin snow began falling across the windshield. I kept thinking about Nancy. She had been gone 5 Christmases, but grief has a peculiar way of ignoring calendars. Sometimes 5 years feels like a lifetime. Sometimes one sentence can put your wife back in the passenger seat beside you. That one belongs where family can see it. I had always assumed she meant Trevor. That night, I wondered if I had been wrong. Maybe family wasn't simply the person you kept giving things to. Maybe it had something to do with who understood what they were being given. When I got home, I carried the painting into the converted garage behind my house. My studio smelled faintly of linseed oil, wood, and cold concrete. For years after Nancy died, I had used the room more for storage than painting. I leaned Winter Orchard against the work table. The brown paper slipped down one corner. That was when I noticed the little card attached to the back. Nancy's handwriting. Small. Neat. Familiar enough to tighten something beneath my ribs. Winter Orchard number 3. I ran my thumb across the faded ink. I had seen that label before. Hundreds of times, probably. But that night, for some reason, the number bothered me. Number 3. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then I hung the painting on the wall instead of putting it away. The next morning, one phone call would make me understand why the number 3 mattered. The number stayed in my head while I made coffee the next morning. Number 3. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring through the window at a yard silvered with frost, trying to remember why Nancy had written it that way. Then another name came back to me. Lydia Hart. I had not spoken to Lydia in years, but once, long before teaching became my full-time life, she had run a small gallery outside Hartford and had been one of the few people who treated my work as more than a hobby. I found her number in an old address book and called. Ed Lawson, she said after I introduced myself. Well, that is a voice I did not expect to hear before breakfast. We exchanged careful pleasantries. Then I told her about the painting. Winter Orchard, I said. The third one. Lydia went quiet. You still have number 3? The question was so sharp that I straightened in my chair. Apparently, send me pictures. Front, back, frame, Nancy's label if it is still there. I almost laughed. Lydia, I painted the thing. I know what it is. I know you painted it, Ed. Send me the pictures. I did. 10 minutes later, she called back. Her voice had changed. Do you know where numbers 1 and 2 are? No idea. Sold years ago. They surfaced last spring. She explained that number 1 had come out of an estate in Rhode Island. Number 2 appeared months later through another estate sale in Massachusetts. Different owners, but both were eventually bought by the same private collector, a man who specialized in regional American painters from the late 20th century. He has been looking for number 3 ever since, Lydia said. I looked toward the studio. Why? Because collectors like completeness, and because the Winter Orchard Group was stronger than you ever gave it credit for. I told her not to turn me into something I had never been. Lydia laughed softly. You are not secretly Rembrandt, Ed. Calm down. Then she explained that a small museum exhibition the previous year had brought renewed attention to several overlooked New England painters from my generation. My name had appeared in an old catalog connected to the show. A few collectors had started paying attention. That does not mean everything in your garage is suddenly valuable, she warned. It means this particular work has a particular buyer for a particular reason. That sounded more believable than fame arriving at my door 30 years late. Lydia asked whether I still had records from the old studio. I told her Nancy had kept almost everything. That afternoon, I opened 2 boxes I had not touched since her death. Nancy had always been better at records than I was. She saved receipts, exhibition cards, shipping notes, dates, even scraps of paper with titles written in pencil. Buried between 2 old catalogs was an inventory sheet listing all 3 Winter Orchard paintings. Number 1, sold. Number 2, sold. Number 3, retained by artist. Nancy had underlined that last entry. Lydia said it was exactly the documentation she needed. Over the next few days, photographs were reviewed, measurements confirmed, and the old records matched against archived gallery material. Nothing felt dramatic. That was what made it convincing. Paper, dates, signatures, dimensions, ordinary things doing the work memory could not. On the 6th day, Lydia called again. "He wants it," I swallowed. "How much?" $200,000. I looked behind me, as if she might have been speaking to someone else. "For that painting?" "For that painting." My first response was not excitement. I thought of Nancy sitting at the dining table looking up at those bare trees. Selling it felt almost disloyal. Lydia must have heard the hesitation. "You do not have to sell it." I spent that evening alone in the studio. By midnight, I understood something. Keeping an object because I loved the person attached to it was one thing. Keeping it because I was afraid moving forward meant leaving her behind was another. The next morning, exactly 1 week after Christmas dinner, I accepted the private offer. The sale price was $200,000. Lydia made sure I understood that fees and taxes still existed, but the number remained hard to believe. I did not call Trevor or Morgan. I needed one quiet evening before the story belonged to anybody else. I got less than 3 hours. My phone rang just after dinner. Trevor's name filled the screen. I answered. He did not say hello. He did not congratulate me. He did not ask how I felt about selling something his mother had loved. He said, "Dad, that money should have been ours." I sat very still with the phone against my ear. My son was not asking what I planned to do with the money. He was telling me he already considered it his. For several seconds after Trevor said the money should have been theirs, I could hear nothing but the faint hum of my refrigerator and his breathing on the other end of the line. I asked him to explain what he meant, though part of me already knew. "You gave the painting to Morgan," he said. "That made it hers. You only took it back because you didn't know what it was worth. That isn't what happened. It is from where I'm standing." Then Morgan's voice came through, close enough that I knew she had been listening beside him. "Ed, I was joking," she said. "You know how I am. I didn't reject anything." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "You laughed at it." "I laugh when I'm uncomfortable. You said if it wasn't worth $50, I shouldn't bother. That was a joke. And Trevor told me to take my junk home." There was a short silence. Trevor answered, "Dad, don't twist one sentence into something bigger than it was." "I'm not twisting it. I'm repeating it." His tone hardened. "You walked into our house intending to give Morgan that painting. You can't decide a week later that the gift didn't count just because somebody offered you money for it." I stared at the dark window over my sink and saw my own reflection. For most of Trevor's life, that tone had worked on me. He would become certain. I would become tired. And somewhere in the middle I would start asking whether peace was worth more than being right. Then he said the one thing he knew would reach deeper than the argument. "Mom would never have done this." I closed my eyes. "She loved that painting," he continued. "She would have wanted it with family, not sold to some stranger. You know that." That was the first moment I nearly gave in, not because I believed his version of Christmas, because he had put Nancy in the room. For 5 years, I had been carrying conversations with her that would never be finished. There were still mornings when I reached for a second coffee mug before remembering. Grief had softened, but it had never lost its ability to make me doubt what came after it. I pictured Nancy beneath Winter Orchard before turning off the dining room light. I remembered her saying it belonged where family could see it. For one dangerous second, I wondered whether I should simply give Trevor enough money to end the fight. Not because he was right, because I was tired of hearing Nancy's name used against me. Then something resisted. If Trevor truly believed the painting belonged with family, he had an odd way of showing it when he thought it was worthless. "I'm not discussing your mother like this," I said. Trevor exhaled sharply. "So that's it? For tonight?" "Dad," I said, "for tonight." I ended the call. My hand shook a little when I set the phone down. I was angry with Trevor, but I was angrier with myself for how close I had come to surrendering because he had found the right wound. I made tea I never drank and sat at the small desk in the den. There was no grand plan in my head, no thought of lawyers or revenge. I simply wanted to remember exactly what had happened. I opened the family message thread and scrolled backward. Christmas photographs passed beneath my thumb. Morgan beside the tree, Trevor holding his new watch, a picture of dinner, then messages from the following morning. I stopped. There it was. From Trevor, "Glad you took that old painting back. Morgan would have put it in storage anyway." I read it twice, then a third time. The words were ordinary. That was what made them useful. He had written them before Lydia called me, before the collector, before anyone knew the painting had serious market value. Back then there had been no question about whether Morgan had accepted it. Trevor had been relieved. I removed it. I took a screenshot, emailed the image to myself, and saved another copy in a folder on my computer. I even wrote down the date and time beside it, not because I expected a fight to become something formal, but because memory had already become part of the argument. My first instinct was to send it straight back to him with one sentence. "Remember this." I even opened our conversation. Then I stopped. All my life, I had rushed to explain myself to Trevor. I corrected misunderstandings before they had time to reveal what people truly believed. I smoothed things over, filled silences, made excuses for everyone. That night I did something different. I closed the message window. Trevor had forgotten what he said when the painting was worthless, and for once I decided not to remind him too soon. The message stayed tucked away on my computer for 3 days before anything else happened. I did not call Trevor. He did not call me. I told myself the silence was a relief, but every time my phone lit up, I looked at the screen a little too quickly. It was Lydia who finally broke the quiet. She called late Tuesday morning. "Ed, I need to tell you something before you hear it another way." That sentence tightened my shoulders. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. Not yet." I waited. Morgan called me. I sat down at the kitchen table. "When?" "Yesterday." I assumed she had wanted to argue about the sale. Instead, Lydia said Morgan had asked whether I still owned many paintings from my early years. "How many?" I asked. She wanted to know exactly that. Lydia told me Morgan had been polite, almost casual. She mentioned being family, said everyone was simply trying to understand what remained from my earlier career. Then she asked how many early Lawson paintings were still in my studio. "What did you tell her?" "That your inventory is none of my business to discuss without you." I let out a breath. "Thank you. Ed, I'm not trying to make this sound more dramatic than it is, but after a sale like this, people start asking questions. Sometimes collectors, sometimes dealers, sometimes relatives. The last word landed harder than the others. After we hung up, I walked out to the studio. Nothing had changed. The same canvases leaned against the wall. The same old easel stood near the north-facing window. Some paintings were finished. Others had been abandoned halfway through because life had interrupted them and I had never gone back. A week earlier, they had simply been mine. Now I wondered what Morgan saw when she imagined the room. Trevor answered that question that afternoon. He showed up alone around 4. No warning. I opened the door and found him standing on the porch with both hands in his coat pockets. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. He followed me into the kitchen and refused coffee. That was unusual enough that I knew he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. For several minutes he talked around the subject. Then he finally said, "Morgan and I are in a rough spot." I said nothing. Our renovation got away from us. "How far?" He looked irritated by the question. "Far enough." He explained that the kitchen and primary bathroom had both gone over budget. Morgan had also borrowed money to expand her staging business, hiring additional help and buying furniture for larger projects she expected to win. Trevor had covered gaps with credit cards and a personal line of credit. "We're not broke," he said quickly. "I didn't say you were. We just need breathing room." I understood then. The painting had not created their problem. It had appeared at exactly the moment they needed someone else's money to solve it. Trevor leaned forward. "Dad, $200,000 could wipe most of this out." "That was the sale price, Trevor. It isn't all sitting in my checking account. You know what I mean." "Yes, and it wouldn't change your life." That sentence bothered me more than I expected. I looked around my kitchen. The old maple cabinets, Nancy's ceramic bowl near the window, the clock I had repaired twice instead of replacing. "How would you know what would change my life?" He sighed. "I'm saying you're comfortable. Your house is paid off. You have retirement income. We're trying to build something. I thought you said you weren't broke. We're not. Then show me the numbers. He frowned. What? Bring me your statements, the renovation costs, business loans, cards, everything. We'll sit down and figure out what you can cut, what can be refinanced, what needs to be paid first. His face changed. That's not what I'm asking. I know. I don't need you going through our finances like I'm 16. Then don't ask me to solve them like you are. He pushed his chair back slightly. This is unbelievable. No. It's an offer to help. No, Dad, it's you turning this into some lesson. I kept my voice even. If you want help making a plan, I'll give you every hour you need. If you're asking me to hand you money because Morgan laughed at something that later became valuable, the answer is different. Trevor stood. His cheeks had gone red. You always do this. Do what? Act like everything you did was some noble sacrifice. I stared at him. I haven't said anything about sacrifice. He grabbed his coat from the chair. You always had time for those galleries when I was a kid. The words came out low and bitter. For a second, neither of us moved. I had expected anger about debt. I had expected another argument about the painting. I had not expected that. What do galleries from 30 years ago have to do with this? Trevor looked toward the door. Forget it. But I could not, because I suddenly heard the age in his voice. Not 39. 9. For the first time, I realized Trevor wasn't only angry about money. He was still angry at the man he remembered me being 30 years ago. Trevor's last sentence followed me long after the front door closed behind him. You always had time for those galleries when I was a kid. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at the chair he had pushed back from the table. I had spent most of our argument thinking we were talking about money. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure. That evening, I carried Nancy's old ledger into the studio and set it beneath the lamp on my work table. She had kept records with a patience I never possessed. Dates of exhibitions, names of galleries, paintings delivered and returned, train tickets tucked between pages, newspaper clippings folded small enough to fit inside the back cover. The handwriting changed over the years, but the order never did. I turned back to the period Trevor had mentioned. He had been 8 when I started showing more regularly. 9 when weekends became complicated. 10 when I convinced myself I could teach during the week, paint at night, and still be everywhere my family needed me. Looking at the dates, I remembered one Saturday more clearly than I wanted to. Trevor had been in a school music program. Nothing grand. A spring performance in the elementary school auditorium. He had practiced the same piece for weeks and complained that his tie made his neck itch. I had promised I would be there. The night before, I attended a gallery opening in Boston. I planned to drive home early the next morning. Then bad weather slowed traffic. By the time I reached the school parking lot, parents were already coming through the doors. I ran inside, still wearing the jacket from the night before. Trevor was standing beside Nancy in the hallway. His face changed when he saw me. Not relief, disappointment, trying hard not to look like disappointment. You missed my part, he said. I'm sorry, buddy. You said you'd be here. I know. Nancy touched his shoulder. Your father came as fast as he could. Trevor looked at the portfolio case still lying across my back seat through the glass doors. Then he walked away. At the time, I believed children forgot moments like that. They don't. They may forget what song they played or what shoes they wore, but they remember how waiting felt. Sitting in the studio all those years later, I could finally hear what Trevor had meant in my kitchen. To him, galleries were not buildings. They were places his father went instead of staying home. That did not excuse what he had done at Christmas. It did not give him a claim on my money or my work, but it made his anger less mysterious. I kept turning pages. The years after that looked different. Fewer exhibitions, then almost none. My teaching schedule grew heavier. Night classes appeared in Nancy's handwriting. Committee meetings. Summer courses. More predictable income. Eventually, the gallery entries disappeared altogether. Trevor had been old enough to notice, but not old enough to understand why. From his point of view, the explanation must have seemed obvious. His father tried to become a painter. It did not work. So he became a teacher. I had never corrected him. For years, I told myself that was kindness. The truth was more complicated, and it belonged to a period of our family life I had worked very hard to keep from Trevor. Nancy's health had begun changing then. At first, there were appointments we called routine because the word frightened us less. Then tests. Then longer appointments. Then days when she came home exhausted and went straight upstairs while I told Trevor she had a headache. I did not want our son measuring his childhood against hospital calendars. and I especially did not want him believing that my choices had been sacrifices made because of him. So when the invitations slowed, I never explained why I stopped accepting them. When I began teaching more classes, I called it practical. When the travel ended, I let Trevor assume there had simply been nowhere worth traveling to. I had protected him from one story. Apparently, I had left enough empty space for him to invent another. Near the middle of the ledger, a loose sheet slipped onto the floor. It was an old inventory page from the house we owned before moving to my current place. Several paintings were listed beside notes about where they had been made. Connecticut River, backfield, north window, old orchard. That last one stopped me. For a moment I could see the orchard exactly as it had been during one January snowfall. Trevor racing between the trees in oversized boots, his scarf hanging loose. A red sled bouncing behind him as he tried to climb a hill that looked enormous to a child and barely existed to an adult. Nancy had stood at the back door shouting for him to put his gloves back on. I smiled despite myself. Somewhere in those years, before resentment and money and Christmas dinners that went wrong, there had simply been a boy in the snow and two parents watching him grow. I closed the ledger. I still had not connected that winter afternoon to the painting hanging a few feet behind me. What I understood was something else. I had spent 30 years protecting Trevor from one painful truth, never realizing the story he invented in its place might hurt us even more. The next 2 days were quiet enough that I almost convinced myself Trevor had gone home and thought about what he said. I should have known better. The first call came from my sister-in-law, Carol, just after lunch. She and Nancy had been close, and although we did not speak every week, she had never been the kind of person to call without a reason. "Ed," she said carefully, "can I ask you something without you getting upset? That is rarely the beginning of a harmless question." "Go ahead." She hesitated. "Did you really take Morgan's Christmas present back after you found out what it was worth?" I stopped wiping the kitchen counter. "Who told you that?" "I don't want to get in the middle." "You already are." Carol sighed. "Morgan mentioned it to a few people. She said you gave her the painting, then learned someone wanted it and changed your mind." I looked toward the hallway leading to the studio. "That isn't what happened. I figured there was more to it." "Did she mention laughing at it?" Silence. "Did she mention Trevor telling me to take it home?" Another pause. "No, of course, she hadn't. I told Carol only that Morgan had rejected the painting and that Trevor had explicitly told me to remove it. I did not mention the message I had saved. Carol thanked me and changed the subject, but the damage was already done. Somebody had taken Christmas night and rewritten it into a story where I was the greedy one. The second call came the following evening from my cousin David. His version was even cleaner. According to what he had heard, Morgan had liked the painting. I discovered its value later, and then I reclaimed it because I wanted the money for myself. "What do you think?" I asked him. "I think it doesn't sound like you." That was kind, but it did not make me feel better. After we hung up, I called Trevor. He answered on the fourth ring. "Dad, have you heard what Morgan is telling people?" A pause. "She's upset." That wasn't my question. "She feels humiliated." Because she laughed at my gift? Because now everybody thinks she threw away something worth $200,000. I stared at the phone. She did throw it away. Not literally. No. She told me it wasn't worth $50, and you told me to take my junk home. Trevor exhaled. "Can we stop repeating that sentence?" "I would love to. Your wife keeps changing it." He was quiet. "Trevor, are you telling people what actually happened?" "I'm not discussing our private business with the whole family." "That sounds responsible until you remember Morgan is already discussing it." "I'm not going to fight with my wife in public just to prove something for you." There it was again. Christmas night in a different form. Morgan said something cruel. Trevor stood beside her. He did not have to lie himself. Silence did the work. I ended the call before anger turned me into exactly the person Morgan needed me to become. That night the family group chat lit up. Nothing openly hostile appeared, but the questions were disguised as concern. Was everything all right between us? Had there been some misunderstanding about the painting? Wouldn't it be easier if everybody sat down together? I opened the screenshot of Trevor's message. "Glad you took that old painting back. Morgan would have put it in storage anyway." My thumb hovered over the attachment button. One tap and everyone would see it. I imagined the immediate silence. Then Morgan defending herself, Trevor accusing me of embarrassing them, relatives choosing sides, 20 messages becoming 40, and somewhere in the middle, the original facts disappearing beneath everybody's opinion. I deleted the attachment before sending it. Instead, I typed one sentence. "Anyone who genuinely wants to know what happened can ask me directly." Then, I put the phone face down. 10 minutes later, Carol called again. I remember something, she said. What? At dinner, before you left. Morgan laughed when you showed her the painting. You saw it back. You remember that? I was standing near the kitchen doorway. I didn't hear every word, but I remember the laugh. And I remember you wrapping the thing back up. That mattered more to me than I expected. Not because I needed Carol to fight my battle, because memory was beginning to separate itself from Morgan's version. The next morning, I took out a yellow legal pad. At the top I wrote, Christmas. Under it, I listed only what I could place in order. I arrived with the painting. Morgan opened it. She made the $50 comment. Trevor told me to take it back. I brought it home. The following morning, Trevor sent his message. Later, I contacted Lydia. Then came the private offer. No adjectives, no accusation, no guesses about motives. Just dates, words, actions. I added Carol's name beside the dinner because she had independently remembered the rejection. Then I stopped. For most of my life, whenever family conflict appeared, I rushed toward it with explanations. I wanted everyone to understand me before they had the chance to misunderstand. This time I felt something different. I did not need to win the loudest version of the story. I needed to know exactly what had happened. Morgan wanted me emotional enough to make her version believable, so I gave her the one thing she wasn't expecting: a record. The legal pad stayed on my kitchen table for the rest of that week. I added nothing to it because nothing new happened, and for a few days I was grateful for that. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and knew something was wrong before I could have explained why. My studio looked almost exactly as I had left it. Almost. People used to tease me about noticing crooked picture frames from across a room. Years of teaching drawing had trained my eyes to measure spaces without thinking. A chair moved 2 inches, a canvas leaning at the wrong angle, a shadow where there should have been color. I stood inside the doorway holding a bag of groceries and stared at the wall beside the old bookcase. There was an empty rectangle. A small painting had been there that morning. It was one of my earlier pieces. A quiet view of a white farmhouse at dusk. Nothing famous. Nothing I had thought much about in years. Now it was gone. I set the groceries down and checked the rest of the studio. No broken window. No damaged door. Nothing else seemed disturbed. That narrowed the possibilities quickly. Trevor still had an emergency key to my house. I had given it to him after Nancy died, during those months when people worried about me being alone. At the time, it had felt sensible, comforting even. My son could get in if I fell, became sick, or stopped answering the phone. I called him. He picked up almost immediately. Were you in my house today? Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Why? Because a painting is missing from my studio. Trevor sighed. Dad, calm down. My grip tightened around the phone. Were you here? Yes. The answer was so casual that for a moment I did not know what to say. You used the emergency key? Morgan needed to look at something. What? One of your paintings. I turned toward the empty patch on the wall. Why? She wanted to see it under better lighting. I actually looked up at the studio windows. My north window was the best natural light in the house. Trevor knew that. He had watched me paint there when he was a boy. Better lighting where? Dad, don't turn this into another crisis. I came home and found something missing from my own studio. Nobody stole anything. I didn't say stole. You're acting like we sold it behind your back. The thought had not occurred to me until he said it. Did you? No. His answer came fast. No one sold anything. Morgan needed it temporarily. For what? She'll bring it back. That wasn't my question. He went quiet again. Then came the familiar irritation. You're overreacting because of what happened with Winter Orchard. No, Trevor. I'm reacting because you used a key I gave you for emergencies to enter my house while I was gone and remove something without asking. It's one painting. That sentence did something to me. A month earlier, one painting had been junk. Then one painting had become $200,000. Now one painting apparently did not matter again because this time they were the ones taking it. When is it coming back? Soon. Trevor. I said soon. I ended the call before we went in another circle. For the next 2 days, I heard nothing from him or Morgan. I considered driving to their house, but I did not know whether the painting was even there. More importantly, I was tired of chasing people for explanations about things they should never have touched. On Saturday morning, Lydia sent me an email. The subject line contained only 3 words. Is this yours? I opened it. There was a link to a real estate listing. The house was enormous, one of those renovated properties with walls of glass, pale stone counters, and rooms designed to look as if nobody had ever spilled coffee or misplaced a shoe. The asking price was well into 7 figures. I clicked through the photographs. Kitchen, dining room, primary bedroom. Then the living room appeared. I stopped. Above a broad limestone fireplace hung the missing painting from my studio. My farmhouse, my frame, my signature in the lower corner. I leaned closer to the screen as though distance might change what I was seeing. It didn't. The room had been staged by Morgan's company. A link beneath the photographs led to a promotional post about the project. I read it once, then again. The description praised Morgan's use of authentic regional character and curated original art. Then came the line that made me sit back, featuring an original work by rediscovered American painter Ed Lawson. For several seconds, all I could think about was Christmas. Morgan holding Winter Orchard. Her laugh, $50, don't bother. Now, another one of my paintings was hanging over a fireplace in a multi-million-dollar house because apparently my name made the room more impressive. The contradiction was almost too clean. She had not taken the farmhouse because she loved it. She had not taken it because Trevor wanted a piece of his father's work. She had taken it because one sale had changed what my signature meant to her clients. Lydia called while I was still staring at the listing. "I thought you should see it," she said. "I'm glad you sent it. Did you authorize this?" "No." That single word sounded different when I heard myself say it. Not wounded. Certain. I looked once more at the photograph of my painting above someone else's fireplace and finally understood what had changed. Morgan hadn't learned to appreciate my work. She had learned how to profit from being related to me. I did not call Trevor immediately after Lydia sent me the listing. I had already spent too much time reacting to whatever version of events he and Morgan handed me. This time, I wanted one thing clear before I spoke to either of them. The painting was coming home, and the key was no longer theirs to use. I called a locksmith first. By late afternoon, the front door, back door, and studio entrance all had new locks. The old emergency key Trevor carried would open nothing. Only then did I call him. "I want the farmhouse painting returned today." Trevor was silent for a moment. "Morgan still needs it for the listing. She never had permission to use it." "It's just staging, Dad. Nobody damaged anything." "That doesn't matter. You're changing the locks over this?" "They're already changed." His voice sharpened. "You actually changed them?" "Yes. That key was for emergencies." "Exactly." I let the words sit between us. "You used it for something that wasn't one." Trevor tried another approach. Morgan was going to return it. She should never have taken it. "You're making this about trust." "No, you made it about trust when you entered my home without asking." For once, he had no quick answer. I told him the painting needed to be back before the end of the day. Morgan delivered it herself an hour later. She did not come inside. She stood on my porch holding the canvas against her coat, her expression tight. "You know I wasn't trying to steal it. I know you didn't ask. It helped the room. That wasn't your decision to make." She handed it over. Then she said something that bothered me more than an apology would have helped. "You should be glad people are interested again." Again, as though the attention had somehow transferred authority along with it. I carried the painting into the studio and hung it exactly where it had been. That should have been the end of the matter. Instead, the next morning Lydia called. "There's something else." I leaned back in my chair. I'm beginning to dislike those words. "I know." She told me an art advisor she knew professionally had contacted her after seeing Morgan's staging post. The advisor had received photographs of several paintings and wanted background information. "What photographs?" "Your studio." I stood up. "My studio?" Lydia sent them while we were still on the phone. The first image showed 3 canvases leaning beneath my north window. The second showed a rack along the back wall. The third had been taken near my work table. I recognized the angle immediately. Someone had stood inside the room and photographed my work. I did not need to ask who had opened the door. Trevor had. What did Morgan tell this advisor? Lydia hesitated. She called the work the Lawson family collection. I almost laughed, but nothing about it felt funny. The what? The Lawson family collection. I looked around the room. There had never been any such thing. There were paintings I had sold, paintings I had kept, paintings Nancy loved, unfinished studies, bad experiments, student demonstrations I had forgotten to throw away, and canvases I kept because I could still remember the day I made them. A collection implied something organized for ownership, something cataloged, something waiting to be managed. Lydia continued carefully. She also said Trevor would eventually be responsible for it. That word landed differently than everything else. Eventually, I repeated it. Yes, Lydia said, her exact wording. I sat down again. Lydia must have heard the change in my breathing. Ed, don't let one sale distort this. Winter Orchard was unusual. The buyer wanted the third piece in a specific series. Some of your early paintings may have value, some may have modest value, and some may have very little market at all. I understand. I'm saying Morgan may not. That was exactly the problem. Morgan was looking at every canvas as if a price were hidden behind it, and Trevor was letting her, maybe helping her. I studied the photographs again. There was something unsettling about seeing my own studio through someone else's eyes. The room where Nancy used to bring me coffee. The stool Trevor once sat on while doing homework. The shelves I built myself. In Morgan's photographs, all of that disappeared. There were only objects, potential assets, things to evaluate, things that could someday become theirs. I thought about Trevor's words in my kitchen. You're comfortable. It wouldn't change your life. Then Morgan's question to Lydia. How many early Lawson paintings are still in his studio? Then the staging. Now, eventually, the argument had moved far beyond the $200,000. That money had simply exposed something I had never wanted to see. Trevor and Morgan had started thinking about what belonged to them after I was gone, and somewhere along the way they had stopped remembering that I was still here, still living in my house, still painting in my studio, still capable of deciding what happened to everything with my name on it. I walked slowly around the room, looking at the canvases one by one. For the first time, I did not see them as old work. I saw responsibility. Mine, not Trevor's, not Morgan's, mine. They weren't waiting for me to decide what happened to my paintings. They were waiting for eventually. The word eventually stayed with me long after Lydia and I ended our call. By the next morning, I had decided that if Trevor and Morgan were going to look at my studio as though it were something waiting to be inherited, then I needed to stop treating my own work like forgotten furniture. I started with a yellow legal pad. Every painting received a number, title, if it had one, approximate year, dimensions, signature location. Any old gallery label still attached to the back. Then I photographed each canvas from the front and rear. It was slow work, but I found something calming in it. For years, Nancy had been the organized one. She knew which gallery had borrowed what, where a receipt had been filed, which painting had once hung in which exhibition. After she died, I had let many of those records sit in boxes because opening them felt too much like opening a door into a room I could no longer enter. Now I opened every box, not to mourn, to know what I had. I separated Nancy's ledgers, exhibition records, old correspondence, and inventory sheets from the rest of the studio paperwork. I made copies and placed the originals in a secure cabinet inside the house. Then I called Lydia. If anybody asks about my paintings, even Trevor, I want them sent to me. That was already my policy. Make it explicit. I will. And nothing leaves this studio unless I authorize it. She paused. You sound different. I feel different. That afternoon, I met Samuel Price. Samuel had handled a few ordinary matters for Nancy and me over the years. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair, reading glasses he constantly pushed back up his nose, and the useful habit of listening longer than most people were comfortable with. I explained the Christmas painting, Trevor's message, the emergency key, Morgan's staging job, and the photographs taken inside my studio. Samuel did not pound the desk or start talking about lawsuits. He asked for dates. Then he asked whether Trevor still had access to the house. Not anymore. Good. He reviewed the copies I brought and told me the most important thing was to keep ownership records clear and make my permissions equally clear. Then he leaned back. What do you want, Ed? I had expected a legal question. Instead, he gave me a personal one. I want them to stop. That's what you don't want. What do you want? I looked down at my hands. For several weeks, nearly every decision I made had been in response to Trevor or Morgan. Protect this. Correct that. Save the message. Change the lock. Get the painting back. I want my life to stop feeling like something they're already dividing. Samuel nodded. Then build your decisions around that. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Lydia had mentioned that renewed interest might make it a good time to consider selling other early pieces. A month earlier, I might have agreed simply because somebody else suddenly thought they were valuable. Instead, I walked into the studio and looked at the old easel near the north window. Dust had settled along the lower shelf. I wiped it clean. Then I found a blank canvas. For a long time, I just stood there. Painting after Nancy died had become difficult in ways I never explained to anyone. Every empty canvas seemed to ask what I was making something for. That evening, I stopped asking. I mixed paint. I drew the first loose lines of a landscape. Nothing ambitious, nothing intended for Lydia, nothing intended for a collector. For the first time in years, I began something without wondering whether Nancy would have liked it, Trevor would understand it, or anyone would pay for it. A knock came at the front door just before dark. Trevor stood outside. The farmhouse painting Morgan had used for staging was already safely back on my studio wall, so he had nothing in his hands. He looked tired, not angry, just tired. "Can I come in?" I let him into the kitchen. For a while, neither of us mentioned the money. Then Trevor rubbed his palms together and said, "This got out of hand." It was the closest thing to an admission I had heard from him. "Yes," I said. "Morgan shouldn't have used the painting without asking." "No." "And I shouldn't have used the key." "No." He nodded. I waited for more. For one moment, I thought it was coming. Then I asked, "Are you dropping the claim about the winter orchard money?" His eyes shifted away. "I still think that's different." There it was, a step backward from the edge, but not far enough. Still, I did not argue. Trevor left 20 minutes later, and I returned to the studio feeling strangely hopeful despite everything. For one evening, I thought my son might finally be stepping back. Until the next time we spoke, when he reached for the one person he knew could still make me doubt myself. Trevor waited 3 days before calling again. By then, I had put a second layer of paint on the new canvas and begun to believe our conversation in my kitchen might have meant something. He had admitted using the key was wrong. He had admitted Morgan should never have taken the farmhouse painting. Those were small admissions, but after weeks of excuses, I had allowed myself to hope they were the beginning of something better. Then he said, "Mom would be ashamed of you." I was standing in the studio when the words came through the phone. I lowered the brush. "What did you say?" "You heard me." His voice was quieter than it had been during our arguments about the money. Somehow that made it worse. "She spent her whole life holding this family together, and now you're choosing money over us." I stared at the wet paint on the canvas. "This is not about choosing money." "Then give us some of it." There was the contradiction. I almost pointed it out, but Trevor continued before I could. "You know we're struggling. You know you could help. Instead, you've changed the locks, brought in an attorney, and started treating us like strangers." "I changed the locks because you used an emergency key to remove something from my studio. I already told you I was wrong about that, and I heard you. Then why are you still punishing us?" Morgan's voice appeared in the background. "Because I made one stupid joke at Christmas." Then she came closer to the phone. "Ed, I said something careless. I get that, but this has become ridiculous. You're acting like I committed some terrible crime because I didn't like a painting." I closed my eyes. "This stopped being about whether you liked the painting a long time ago. Then what is it about?" "Permission." Neither of them answered. I could have listed every boundary they had crossed, but I was tired of presenting evidence to people who already knew what they had done. Trevor spoke again. "Mom would have helped us." That was different from saying Nancy would be ashamed. It was softer, more dangerous, because he was probably right. Nancy would have wanted to help our son. So would I. That had never been the question. The question was how many times help could erase consequences before it became something else. But after the call ended, certainty deserted me. I sat at the kitchen table with my checkbook in front of me. For nearly 20 minutes, I considered writing Trevor a check. Not for everything. Enough to make the pressure stop. Enough that Morgan would stop talking to relatives. Enough that Trevor might come over for coffee without every conversation turning into a negotiation. I hated myself a little for wanting that peace. Then I understood what I was actually afraid of. Nancy had been gone 5 years. My parents were gone. Most of the people who remembered Trevor as a little boy existed now as Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, or names I heard at funerals. Trevor was the last person alive who belonged to every version of my family. He remembered Nancy laughing. He remembered our old house. He remembered summer vacations, burnt Thanksgiving rolls, the dog we had before he went to college. Somewhere after Nancy died, I had started treating my relationship with Trevor as if losing him would mean losing all of that too. Maybe that was why I kept making things easier for him. Maybe I had not been protecting Trevor. Maybe I had been protecting myself from another empty chair. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery. I had stopped bringing flowers every visit because Nancy would have called it wasteful in winter. That day I brought nothing. I brushed a little frozen grass from the base of the stone and stood there with my hands in my coat pockets. I don't know what you tell me, I said. The cemetery offered no answer. That was all right. Nancy had already given me plenty when she was alive. One memory came back from Trevor's teenage years. He had damaged our old station wagon after taking it without permission. Nobody was hurt, but the repair bill was more than a 16-year-old could possibly pay. My instinct had been to cover everything and move on. Nancy stopped me in the kitchen. He needs us, I told her. Yes. So we help him. Yes. I remembered her expression. But helping him isn't the same thing as removing every consequence. Trevor spent that summer working part-time and paying back a portion of the repair. He complained for weeks. Then he paid it. Somewhere along the way, after Nancy died, I had forgotten the second half of her lesson. Trevor called again that evening. His tone was calmer. Did you think about what I said? Yes. And? I looked toward the studio. I think you miss your mother. He said nothing. So do I. Dad, you can miss her. You can be angry with me. You can think I'm making the wrong decision. I paused, but you don't get to use her memory as a receipt. The line went silent. I did not take it back. After we hung up, I walked into the spare room where I had secured Nancy's old records. I pulled out the ledger, the exhibition folders, and a stack of calendars I had barely looked at since she died. This time, I was not searching for ammunition against Trevor. I wanted to remember what had actually happened to us. That night, I opened Nancy's old records again, and the dates told a story Trevor had never known. I spread Nancy's records across the dining table because there was more room there than in the studio. For years, I had remembered that period of my life as a blur of hospital parking lots, lesson plans, grocery lists, and half-finished canvases. Nancy had remembered it differently. She had written everything down. Near the bottom of one storage box, I found a cream-colored folder with the name of a gallery in Boston stamped across the front. I knew it before I opened it. The paper inside was dated nearly 30 years earlier. It was not a rejection letter. It was an agreement. The gallery wanted to represent several of my paintings for a regional exhibition program that would have taken my work through Boston, Providence, and eventually New York. There were notes about future shows, introductions to collectors, and the possibility of a longer arrangement if the first season went well. He sat back. For years, I had remembered that opportunity as something smaller. Maybe because making it smaller had made walking away easier. I kept reading. Another folder held exhibition schedules from that same year. My name appeared more often as the months went on. A curator had written beside one show, "Strong response to Lawson landscapes." That was not fame. It was not a guarantee, but it was momentum, the kind of momentum I had once spent years hoping for. Then I found my withdrawal letter. I recognized my own signature before I read a word. Thank you for your confidence in my work. Due to family circumstances, I will be unable to continue with the upcoming program. Short, Polita. Final. The date caught my attention. I reached for one of Nancy's old calendars. 4 days later, written in her neat blue handwriting, was the beginning of a medical treatment schedule that lasted nearly 3 months. Appointments filled entire weeks. Blood work. Specialist visits. Hospital. Follow-up. Trevor's school pickup times were written around them. My teaching schedule appeared in the margins. Evening class Tuesday. Office hours Thursday. Home by 5. The pieces began fitting together with an accuracy memory alone had never given me. I had not stopped traveling because nobody wanted my paintings. I had stopped because Nancy could no longer manage those weeks alone, and because Trevor needed at least one parent whose schedule did not change every time the phone rang. I remembered the conversation now. Nancy had been sitting on the edge of our bed, exhausted from another appointment. "You don't have to cancel everything," she told me. "I'm not canceling everything. You know what I mean." "I know." She looked at me for a long time. "You'll regret it." "Maybe. You worked hard for this." "So did we." That had been my answer. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Just practical. We needed reliable insurance, predictable income, someone home at night. Teaching gave me those things. So I took more classes, then a full schedule, then committee work. The gallery invitations became fewer because I kept saying no. Eventually, people stopped asking. To Trevor, the sequence must have looked completely different. He remembered the years when I traveled. He remembered waiting at school. Then suddenly, the exhibitions disappeared. I became Mr. Lawson from the community college, a teacher who painted in the garage, What else was a child supposed to conclude? Dad tried. Dad failed. Dad came home. That story had lived in him for decades, because I never replaced it with the truth. I could not even blame him for all of it. There were weekends when I chose a show over something smaller at home. Times Nancy carried more than her share because I believed one more exhibition might change everything. Trevor's hurt had not been invented, but he never saw what came afterward. He never saw me turn down the chance to keep going. I had made sure of that. I kept sorting. Toward the bottom of the box was a stack of old inventory cards, held together with a brittle rubber band. Farmhouse at dusk, Connecticut River study, January field. Then, Winter Orchard number 3. I stopped. The front listed the size, year, medium, and my old inventory number. On the back, Nancy had written a note in pencil. Trevor's red sled. Keep this one. I read it twice. Then the memory from the ledger came back in full. The orchard behind our old house, fresh snow, Trevor dragging that red sled between the trees, his gloves half off because he hated wearing them. Nancy standing at the back door, and me farther out with a sketchbook, trying to catch the blue-gray shadows before the light changed. I looked toward the studio. Winter Orchard was no longer there, but I could see every inch of it in my mind. The small streak of red near the lower edge that most people would have mistaken for a fence marker. I knew exactly what it was now. I put the card down carefully. I did not call Trevor. Not yet. The discovery was not a weapon, and I refused to turn it into one. For the first time, I understood how much of our conflict had grown from 2 incomplete memories of the same family. Trevor remembered the father who left for galleries. I remembered the father who eventually stopped leaving. Both were true, but only one of us knew what came between them. I had not failed and come home defeated. I had walked away while doors were still opening, and my son had spent 30 years believing the opposite. The call came 4 days after I found Nancy's old gallery papers. I was in the studio trying to decide whether the new landscape needed more gray in the sky when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. Is this Edward Lawson? Yes. My name is Michael Grant. I'm with Grant Development. The name meant nothing to me. He sounded professional, almost cheerful. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Morgan Lawson gave us your contact information as part of a proposal she submitted. I set the brush down. Morgan gave you my number? Yes. We're reviewing staging firms for a model property in Greenwich. She included something unusual in her presentation, and I wanted to confirm the details directly with you. I already knew I was not going to like the next sentence. Michael continued. She mentioned exclusive access to selected works from the Lawson collection. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. The Lawson collection? Yes, your paintings. I looked around the studio. The canvases seemed suddenly louder in the silence. What exactly did Morgan promise you? He hesitated, probably hearing something in my voice. She proposed rotating several original Lawson works through the property during the sales period. She said it would give the house a regional connection that competing developments couldn't duplicate. I thought about the farmhouse painting hanging above that limestone fireplace. One unauthorized staging job had apparently become a business strategy. Mr. Grant, Morgan does not have exclusive access to my work. There was a pause. She doesn't? No. I was under the impression this had already been arranged within the family. It has not. I kept my voice calm. Morgan's business was not mine to destroy. I had no interest in calling her dishonest, threatening her clients, or telling strangers about Christmas. I only needed to answer the question I had been asked. My paintings are mine, I said. I decide where they go. Morgan has never been authorized to promise them to clients. Michael became more careful. I appreciate you clarifying that. I'm sorry if you were given another impression. No need to apologize. This is exactly why I called. After we hung up, I stood beside the easel without painting. I was angry, but the anger felt different from Christmas. Morgan insulting my work had hurt. Morgan borrowing the farmhouse without permission had crossed a line. This was something else. She was now promising future access to things she did not own, as if my name were another piece of furniture in her warehouse. My phone rang again 20 minutes later. Michael, I thought you should see the language yourself, he said. I don't want there to be any confusion about what was presented. He emailed a few pages from Morgan's proposal. I opened them at the kitchen table. Most of it looked exactly like what I expected from her business. Photographs of beautifully staged rooms, furniture plans, lighting concepts, notes about target buyers and regional character. Then I reached the section labeled Art Integration. There it was. Exclusive access to selected works from the Lawson family collection subject to project rotation and placement requirements. I read the sentence slowly, then the next line, collection access coordinated through Trevor Lawson. My son's name sat there in clean black type. I stared at it longer than anything else on the page. Until that moment, part of me had still been separating Trevor from Morgan's professional choices. He had opened my studio. He had given her access to the farmhouse painting. Those things were his responsibility. But I had allowed myself to believe the larger business language belonged to Morgan alone. Now I could not. I called Trevor. He answered cautiously. What's wrong? Did you tell Morgan you could coordinate access to my paintings? Silence. That same small silence I had heard when I asked whether he had entered my house. Where did you hear that? From the developer she promised them to. Trevor exhaled. Dad, that proposal was sent weeks ago. I looked back at the document. Weeks ago? Before everything blew up. Before. The word changed something. Before you brought the farmhouse back? Yes. Before you came here and said this had gotten out of hand? Yes. I checked the date printed at the bottom of the proposal. He was telling the truth. It had been submitted several days before that evening in my kitchen. For a moment, I felt an unexpected kind of relief. Not because what they had done was acceptable. It wasn't. But Trevor's attempt to step back had not necessarily been another trick. He had started regretting something after the consequences were already in motion. That mattered. Not enough to erase the choice. Enough to understand it more clearly. You still put your name on access you didn't have, I said. I thought it was going to be a few paintings for staging. I didn't think she'd write it like that. Did you ask me? No. Then what exactly did you think you were coordinating? He had no answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not mention Nancy. I did not tell him about the gallery agreement I had found. That truth belonged to another conversation. Instead, I told him something simpler. You cannot promise what belongs to someone else just because you expect it might belong to you someday. Dad, I know. I don't think you did. The line stayed quiet. After we hung up, I returned to Michael's email and read that one sentence again. Collection access coordinated through Trevor Lawson. For weeks I had wondered how far Morgan had gone. Now I was looking at my son's name beside the promise she never had the right to make. Samuel arranged the meeting in a small conference room at his office because I had made one thing clear from the beginning. I did not want a courtroom if a table would do. Trevor and Morgan arrived with an advisor of their own, and the four of us sat beneath a framed photograph of the Connecticut shoreline while a pot of coffee went untouched between us. Morgan spoke first. Her tone was calm, almost wounded. I accepted the painting at Christmas. Ed later learned what it was worth and decided he wanted it back. I looked at her across the table. She did not laugh this time. She did not mention $50. She did not mention junk. Trevor leaned forward. That's how we remember it, too. Samuel glanced at me, but I gave him a small nod. I wanted them to finish. For weeks, I had watched their story change whenever the facts became inconvenient. That morning, I wanted to hear the version they were prepared to stand behind. Morgan continued. Yes, I made a joke. I've admitted that. But people joke when they open presents. That doesn't mean I rejected it. So you accepted it? Samuel asked. Yes. Trevor nodded. She did. And your father then took it with him? Trevor hesitated only briefly. Yes. After Morgan had accepted it? Yes. I folded my hands on the table. What did I say when I picked it up? Morgan answered quickly. You were upset. That wasn't my question. Her mouth tightened. Trevor stepped in. Dad, nobody remembers every word from Christmas dinner. I did, but I still did not say so. Instead, Trevor changed direction. Mom wanted those paintings to stay in the family. That caught me, not because it proved anything, because Nancy had said something close to it. I could hear her voice from years earlier while we were rearranging the dining room after repainting it. These paintings are our family's history. At the time, I had understood exactly what she meant. They carried places we had lived, seasons we remembered, pieces of Trevor's childhood. Now, sitting across from my son, I felt the old guilt rise again. Trevor saw it. Dad, you know I'm right about that. Morgan softened her voice. Nancy cared about those paintings. You said so yourself. For a few seconds, I wondered whether I had become so focused on protecting my boundaries that I was ignoring something Nancy would have considered important. Then I looked at Trevor. He was 39 years old. I was 68, and we were discussing my belongings as though preserving family history required transferring control from the living person who created it to the child who might someday inherit it. I finally spoke. Your mother did say they were our family's history. Trevor's expression changed slightly. Morgan sat straighter. Then I continued, "But family history isn't the same thing as family property." Neither of them answered. "Your mother never said you owned my work while I was still alive." Morgan looked toward her advisor. "I'm not saying we own everything." "No? No, we're talking about the painting you gave me." "Then let's stay with that painting." I turned to Trevor. "On Christmas night, did you tell me to take it home?" "No." The answer came plainly. I looked at Morgan. "Did you hear him tell me to take it home?" "No." Trevor shifted in his chair. "Dad, we've already gone over this. Not like this." I waited a moment. "You're both saying that Morgan accepted the painting, and I removed it afterward without her rejecting it." "That's what happened," Morgan said. Trevor nodded. "Yes." Samuel looked at me again. This time I opened the folder in front of me. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. For weeks I had imagined how satisfying this moment might be. Instead, I mostly felt tired. I slid a printed copy of Trevor's message across the table. He looked down. "Glad you took that old painting back. Morgan would have put it in storage anyway." The room became very quiet. Morgan read it, then looked at Trevor. Trevor stared at the page as if he could somehow move the words around by looking hard enough. "That was the morning after Christmas," I said, "before Lydia called me, before anybody knew what Winter Orchard was worth." Trevor rubbed his jaw. "I don't remember sending this." "I do. I might have meant something different." "What?" He did not answer. Morgan tried. "Maybe he was just trying to make you feel better." "Then why would I need to feel better if you had happily accepted the painting?" She stopped. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody needed to. The contradiction was sitting on the table in Trevor's own words. Samuel asked a few practical questions after that, but the center of the dispute had already collapsed. Morgan's claim depended on a Christmas story that did not match what Trevor had written, while the painting still seemed worthless. Eventually, Morgan leaned back. "Fine. We won't pursue the money." Trevor did not look at me. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I thought about how easily all of this could have ended at Christmas with one simple sentence from my son. "Morgan went too far, Dad." That was all I had wanted then. Now the issue had grown far beyond one rejected gift. Because the ownership argument might have been finished, but Morgan had already used my name in rooms I had never entered, promised access I had never granted, and involved Trevor in decisions neither of them had the right to make. The argument over who owned the painting was finished, but Morgan had already made promises about my name that couldn't be taken back with one apology. The dispute ended in April, but the silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. Trevor called twice during the next month, both times about ordinary things. Morgan did not call at all. I kept painting. By early June, Lydia had convinced me to let her organize a small retrospective at a regional gallery outside Hartford. "Small," I told her. "Small," she promised. "No grand rediscovery of Ed Lawson." She smiled. "I'll tell the marching band to stay home." The exhibition included a handful of early landscapes, several paintings borrowed from longtime owners, and 3 new pieces from my studio. Lydia also contacted the collector who had bought Winter Orchard No. 3. To my surprise, he agreed to loan it back for opening night. When I saw it hanging on a clean white wall under proper gallery lights, I felt something I had not expected. I did not want it back. I was glad it existed somewhere beyond my dining room, beyond Christmas, beyond the fight. It had survived all of us. Trevor and Morgan arrived together about 40 minutes after the doors opened. Morgan wore a dark green dress and the careful expression of someone entering a room where she was unsure how much people knew. Trevor looked uncomfortable in a jacket he kept tugging at near the collar. I greeted them politely. Neither of them mentioned the $200,000. For a while, that was enough. People moved through the gallery slowly. Former students introduced themselves. One woman reminded me that I had taught her charcoal drawing 25 years earlier. A retired teacher told me she still had a landscape she bought from me when neither of us had much money. Nobody asked me what everything was worth. That alone made the evening feel different from Christmas. I was speaking with Lydia near the back wall when a man approached Morgan and Trevor. I recognized him vaguely as someone from the design and development circles Morgan worked in. He shook my hand. "Mr. Lawson, congratulations. Morgan's told us quite a bit about the collection." Morgan's face changed before he finished the sentence. I looked at him. "The collection?" He smiled, unaware. "She said she was helping manage some of your work. We thought that was such an interesting family connection." Morgan stepped forward. There was some confusion about that. The man glanced at her. "Oh, I thought you said you were helping coordinate things." "I meant informally." Her voice had tightened. I could have corrected her myself. I had done enough correcting. Instead, I looked at Trevor. For one instant, I saw Christmas again. Morgan laughing, my painting in her hands. Trevor looking at me and shrugging as though none of it mattered enough to challenge. He knew what I was asking without my saying a word. Morgan looked at him too. Trevor swallowed. Then he said, "No." Morgan turned toward him. He continued, "Dad manages his own work. Morgan and I had no right to represent it like we did." The man's smile faded into polite uncertainty. "I see." Morgan's cheeks flushed. "Trevor, that's not exactly what happened." "Yes, it is." His voice was not loud. That made the moment stronger. "We used Dad's work without asking. We shouldn't have." For once, Trevor did not hide behind silence, because silence was easier than disappointing his wife. The conversation moved on awkwardly. The man excused himself. Morgan walked toward the refreshments without looking at either of us. Trevor remained beside me. "I should have said that months ago." "Yes," he nodded. I did not rescue him from the discomfort. Later, near closing time, I found Trevor standing alone in front of Winter Orchard number 3. He had been there long enough that the gallery had thinned around him. I stopped a few feet away. He leaned closer to the painting. His eyes settled near the lower edge. There was a tiny slash of faded red between 2 trees. Nothing important to most viewers, just enough color to pull the eye through all that snow. Trevor stared at it. Then he looked at me. "Dad." Something in his voice had changed. "Is that my red sled?" I looked at the painting. Yeah, it was. He turned back toward it. For a long time, he said nothing. "I remember that hill. It wasn't much of a hill. It was when I was 9. I smiled despite myself. Trevor stepped closer. "So you painted that day?" "I sketched part of it that day." He looked at the orchard again. "You remembered the sled." "I remembered more than you thought." His face tightened. I could almost see him trying to fit that small red mark beside every memory he had carried of galleries, missed school events, and a father he believed had chosen painting over him. I did not explain Nancy's note. Not yet. He had found the memory himself. That mattered. When Trevor finally looked at me, there was no argument in his face. Only something quieter. Regret, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. My son had finally defended me when telling the truth cost him something. But one right choice could not erase everything that came before it. The change in Trevor at the gallery did not erase the months before it, and I was careful not to pretend otherwise. I had spent too many years confusing one good moment with proof that everything was fixed. A week after the preview, Michael Grant sent me a brief email. He thanked me again for clarifying the limits around my artwork and said his company had chosen another staging firm for the Greenwich project. He did not criticize Morgan. He did not need to. The sentence told me everything. She had tried to make her proposal more valuable by promising access to something she did not control. Once that promise disappeared, so did the opportunity. I felt no urge to celebrate, but I did feel something close to relief. For once, I had not protected someone from the natural consequence of a choice they made. Trevor called 2 nights later. Morgan lost the project. I heard. He sounded surprised. "From who?" "Michael Grant." There was a pause. "She thinks you cost her the contract." I answered a question. I know. That answer mattered. A few months earlier, Trevor would have blamed me before the sentence was finished. This time, he continued, "She shouldn't have promised the paintings." "No, she knows that now." I leaned back in my chair. Knowing something after it costs you is still knowing it. Trevor gave a tired laugh. "Yeah." Then he told me they had started making changes. Not because I asked, because they had run out of easier options. They sold Morgan's luxury SUV and kept Trevor's older sedan. The kitchen renovations stopped with 2 planned upgrades unfinished. Morgan postponed hiring another employee and began renting specialty furniture only when a signed staging contract justified the expense instead of buying inventory in advance. "We'll be okay," Trevor said. "I hope so." He waited. For years, that pause would have been where I offered money. This time, I let it remain empty. Finally, he said, "I'm not asking you for anything. I know." And I did. That distinction felt important. The $200,000 from Winter Orchard remained mine. After the costs associated with the sale and the obligations that came with the income, the rest stayed where I decided it would stay. No rescue check, no family loan disguised as a gift, no payment made because silence at Christmas would feel easier afterward. Trevor and Morgan had created their financial problem before the painting became valuable. They were going to solve it without treating my good fortune as their emergency fund. Trevor tested one other boundary a few weeks later. Not aggressively, almost carefully. We were having coffee when he asked, "Did you change your will?" I looked at him over my cup. "Why?" "I'm just asking. That's the problem." His face tightened. "I'm not trying to start anything." "Then don't." He looked down. I softened my voice, but not the answer. "What I decide about my estate is private until I choose otherwise. Whatever may happen someday does not give anybody ownership today." Trevor nodded slowly. He did not ask again. The emergency key stayed gone too. There were no dramatic ceremonies around that decision. I did not hold it over him. I simply never replaced it. Morgan remained distant for nearly a month. Then one afternoon an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Her handwriting was on the front. Inside was a single page. She did not blame Trevor. She did not mention childhood poverty or business pressure. She did not ask me to understand her intentions. She wrote that she had mocked something important to me, changed the story afterward, used my work without permission, and spoken about access she did not possess. Near the end, she wrote, "I kept treating your paintings differently depending on what I thought they could do for me. I understand why you stopped trusting me." There was no request for money, no request that I call, no sentence asking me to forgive her. I read the letter twice and put it in the same drawer where I kept the Christmas timeline. An apology did not restore trust, but for the first time, Morgan had described what she did without changing the fact. That was worth recognizing. Several weeks later, on a cool Saturday morning, someone knocked on my front door. Trevor stood outside holding 2 paper coffee cups. Behind him, parked along the curb, was the older sedan. No polished SUV, no sign that he expected me to notice. He lifted one cup, black, no sugar. "You remembered. I usually remember more than you think." The sentence almost made me smile. He glanced toward the converted garage. "Are you working?" "A little." "Can I see?" He did not walk toward the studio. He waited. That small hesitation meant more to me than any speech he could have rehearsed. I took my coffee from him. Then I opened the door wider. "Come in." For the first time in years, Trevor entered my studio because I invited him, not because he assumed the door belonged to him. Trevor stood near the easel with his coffee in both hands, studying the half-finished landscape, as if he were afraid that asking the wrong question might send him back outside. He did not ask what it was worth. He did not ask whether Lydia had a buyer. He only said, "You've been painting a lot." "I have." That became the pattern over the months that followed. I painted. Some mornings I worked for an hour. Other days I looked up and realized the afternoon light had moved all the way across the studio floor. Lydia placed a few of my older works with interested buyers. One sold for a respectable amount. Another attracted almost no attention at all. Years earlier, that would have bothered me. Now, I found it strangely freeing. A painting could fail to sell and still belong on my wall. A collector could admire something I dislike. A canvas could matter because of the afternoon when I painted it, not because somebody wrote a number beside my name. Winter Orchard had taught me what the market could do. My new work taught me what the market could not do. By late summer, I had decided what I wanted to do with part of the money from the sale. I went back to the community college where I had taught for more than 20 years and met with the dean of the arts program. Walking through those halls again felt like stepping into an old coat. The classrooms had new computers and different chairs, but the smell of charcoal, paper, and paint had not changed. I told the dean I wanted to create a small annual grant. "For students?" she asked. "Not exactly. I thought about Nancy, about the years when her treatment schedules replaced gallery schedules, about the men and women I had taught in evening classes who arrived exhausted after work, caring for parents, raising children, or rebuilding lives they had set aside for someone else. I want it for people coming back," I said. "Coming back to school, coming back to themselves." We called it the Nancy Lawson Returning Artist Grant. It would support older adults who had left creative work behind while caring for a spouse, raising a family, surviving financial trouble, or simply doing what life required of them. Nancy would have objected to having her name on anything until I explained where the money was going. Then she would have pretended not to be pleased. The first recipient was a woman named Patricia Hale. She was 62. She had stopped painting more than 20 years earlier while raising 2 daughters and later caring for her husband through a long illness. At the small award meeting, Patricia carried a sketchbook pressed tightly against her chest. After everyone else had left, she opened it for me. The drawing showed an ordinary kitchen table beside a window. A coffee cup, reading glasses, morning light falling across the wood. It was careful and quiet. The kind of picture Morgan might once have looked at and asked what it cost. Patricia touched the edge of the page. "I'm Rusty. You're working." She smiled nervously. Then she said, "I don't know if anything I make will ever be worth much." For a second, I was back at Christmas. Brown paper on Morgan's lap. Her laugh. "If it's not worth $50, don't bother." I looked at Patricia's drawing again. That's not the first question anymore. She studied me. "What is?" I smiled. "Do you want to keep making them?" She looked down at the sketchbook. "Yes. Start there." Trevor continued visiting. Not every week, not on a schedule. Sometimes he brought coffee. Once he helped me replace a warped shelf in the studio. Another afternoon, he spent nearly an hour looking through old exhibition programs without asking why I had never told him about them. I eventually told him enough. Not every medical detail, not every sacrifice. I did not want gratitude turned into a different kind of debt, but he learned that I had left the gallery circuit by choice. He was quiet for a long time afterward. "I thought you quit because it didn't work." "I know. Why didn't you tell me? You were a kid." "I stopped being one a long time ago." That was true. "So did I said. Morgan remained more distant. I saw her at holidays and occasional dinners. She never asked to borrow a painting again, never discussed my studio with clients, never made another joke about homemade gifts. I did not need her to become a different person overnight. Respecting the boundary was enough to begin with. In October, I finished the landscape Trevor had seen developing for months. It was the orchard behind our old house. Not winter orchard again. This one was warmer. Late afternoon instead of winter morning. Long shadows across the grass. A path running between the trees. Near the edge stood the suggestion of a boy, older than the child with the red sled but not yet a man. I did not tell Trevor what the figure meant. Maybe someday I would. Maybe he already knew. When the paint finally dried, I carried the canvas to the work table and turned it over. For most of my career, the back of a finished painting meant information. Title, date, inventory number, sometimes a gallery label, sometimes a price. I wrote the title and the date. Then beneath them, I added 2 words, "Not for sale." I stood there for a while, looking at them. The $200,000 had changed my circumstances. Trevor's apology had changed something between us. Morgan's consequences had taught her what my explanations never could. But none of those things had restored my life. I had done that myself. One boundary, one decision, and eventually one blank canvas at a time. Some things become priceless the moment you stop offering them to people who only know how to ask what they cost. What happened with that painting taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier. Love should never require you to surrender your dignity just to keep a place at the family table. For years, I believed being a good father meant fixing every problem, forgiving every insult, and giving a little more whenever my son needed something. But help without boundaries can slowly become permission, and the people we love can begin expecting sacrifices they no longer appreciate. I also learned that standing up for yourself does not mean you have to become cruel. I did not need to destroy Trevor or Morgan to regain control of my life. I only had to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. If someone in your family repeatedly ignores your boundaries, do not keep explaining yourself until you are exhausted. Be clear about what belongs to you, what you are willing to give, and what you will no longer tolerate. Keep records when facts matter. Protect your home and finances, and do not allow guilt, inheritance, or memories of someone you loved to be used against you. At the same time, leave room for people to change if their actions truly change with them. An apology matters far less than new behavior. Most importantly, do not wait for your children, your neighbors, or the world to tell you that your life still has value. Sometimes the strongest form of justice is simply taking back what was always yours: your choices, your peace, your purpose, and your self-respect.